We are so happy to have you here this evening, and we are so pleased to have Kim Johnson with us. We are huge fans of her work. I am Allison Kastner. I am the Reader Services Librarian for Multnomah County Library. With me here, I have my colleagues Shannon, Library Shannon, in the background helping with technical issues. Jennifer Kaiser is a librarian here at Multnomah County, as well as Laurel Winter, and they are both on the Intellectual Freedom Committee at the library, which is a committee that keeps track of challenges and banning of materials and helps inform our responses when we get those kind of challenges. So if there are questions later on about the library, they can answer those. And then we will have plenty of time at the end for questions. This event is made possible by the National Endowment for the Humanities Fund of the Library Foundation. And now I'm really pleased to introduce Kim Johnson. Kim Johnson was a social activist as a teen and is now an educator, a college administrator, and the award-winning author of This Is My America, a story that explores racial injustice against innocent Black men who are criminally sentenced and the families left behind to pick up the pieces. It's an amazing book. I highly recommend you read it. Just so full of interesting and poignant issues, and just a really good read. Her new book, Invisible Sun, comes out in 2023 in the summer, I think, in June. This teen coming of age story explores love and friendship under the backdrop of a global pandemic in a self-proclaimed progressive city with more Black Lives Matter signs than Black people. That sounds a little familiar. Look for her next novel coming in June, and follow Kim on social media at Casey Johnson Writes. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Kim Johnson.
Great. Thank you. It's so wonderful to be here with you all. And yes, my next novel, Invisible Sun, is set in Portland. So if it sounded familiar, get ready. It is wonderful to be here tonight. I want to first start off by thanking all of the organizers and supporters of Multnomah County Library as part of their banned Books Week as a way to celebrate freedom to read. I especially want to thank Allison and Alicia and Shannon and really everyone involved in putting this together. I have always been a supporter of the libraries because that used to be the place when I was in elementary school where my mom would take us all to the library and we would just have stacks and stacks and stacks of books. And so it's really nice to see that sort of full circle. And so I love to be here with you all tonight. And, also, something that's interesting for me whenever I do an event in Oregon, it feels incredibly special to me. And sometimes I share more because it feels more like family in many ways. And so I hope as I go through what I wanted to talk about in the first part is that in our discussion, we can see each other as family and talk with each other in that way. Part of my sort of return anytime I'm doing an event that's home for me, Oregon for me, is it's special because I never imagined that I would be speaking so widely about my work. I started writing now over 10 years ago for the first time, writing a novel, and having never written a short story before. It just was something that, having a love of reading, a creative mind, I started writing. And so I certainly never thought that I would ever be published. That just wasn't a thing that I thought. And I definitely never thought that I would be sitting here talking with you all about banned books. And in fact, my book being banned and challenged. That was not something I thought about as I was very excited to have my book released as a debut in July of 2020. On top of the summer of a pandemic, on top of a racial reckoning in our country, where my work became to be much more relevant in terms of large conversations that were occurring. So I have some slides that I want to share, mostly because I like visuals, and you guys don't want to stare at me the whole time. So you can still see me in my little window, but I'm going to ask Shannon if Shannon can share the screen, and we see it. It looks great, Shannon. And we can go to the next slide. Thank you. Great. So I have this quote here from Plato: "The power of story can help us reckon with our past and shape our future." Uh, you know, I really believe, for me as a writer, that's the place that I'm writing from. There are many ways in which writers come to story, how they're inspired, how they think about their writing. Because of my background as a young person and my involvement in wanting to work with especially young people, or people who are sort of reinventing who they are, coming as a non-traditional student, I really believe that all of our stories can change the way that we think about the world. And so for me, this quote by Plato is, "This is what storytelling does. It expands our understanding of the world. It provides empathy, reflection, and my favorite term that I love to talk about all the time is possibilities. The possibilities. That's why I write, to think about the possibilities that we can have when I'm writing contemporary stories, and especially for me as a writer, and thinking about this quote and thinking about where we are in the world, where we're seeing this very heightened increase of banning and challenging of books, where it has become politicized, where it no longer seems to be about the story, but about a particular agenda or battle with each other. And I firmly believe that in the work of fighting against banning and thinking about where we might stand when there's a book that maybe we don't support or we don't want to read, the right that other people have to be able to tell their story from their particular lens, right or wrong. Um, and in the work, especially of works that have been banned and challenged, I want to speak mostly to the voices of underrepresented communities that often haven't had a space at the table or a space on the shelf, right? That's who I want to focus this particular conversation on, because so much of this representation, it's about getting our word out there. Because if we don't learn from our past, we risk repeating in the future. And so many of our stories, especially by underrepresented writers, feel like our stories are on the line, of changing the future, of changing perspectives, of being included in the story, in the perspectives of people's lives. Because when we don't, we're not documenting experiences of other people's thinking. You know, storytelling can be a part of that documentation of history. It can be a part of building broader understanding, especially if we allow more voices to share their perspective. You know, it does hold the same power. That is also the exact reason that books are used as a ploy to be challenged or banned, right? It's awakening. It's changing the way that we think and feel about sometimes things that we either deeply know, or haven't had any exposure. And so these challenges and these bans are about controlling the narrative, avoiding uncomfortable conversations, and taking away access to power by really stifling into the minds of often our young people who grew up and be the ones that do shape our society, our communities. They're the ones that are voting and the ones that will change our policies in the future. And if change is what people fear, you can ascertain why the power of knowledge and expanding experiences and the understanding of experiences are in so many cases why we're seeing so many stories and novels and picture books being challenged, in particular from underrepresented communities. And I see it as my vehicle for change. It's the reason why I started writing, is because I wanted to get my story out there, and expand that. And so the time that we're going to share today, as I focus on these issues, I want to focus on the threat that we must push back on in our society. How we want to avoid controlling our mind, our voice, our vote, and this sort of dissent in the discourse and the pushback to the rising awareness of communities that want to do better, the communities that want to read broadly, individuals and families and schools and organizations that are really pledging to understand and break the cycle of whether it's systemic racism, reckoning with race, looking at inequities, inclusion, disenfranchisement, or just plain broad representation that don't sort of fall in particular boxes that we are so used to certain communities having only their story told in those ways. And so, so for me, in bearing witness and the kinds of stories that I tell, especially in the work, if you're not familiar with my work and This Is My America, it really was a story that I was writing in a time where many of the students that I was working with in 2015 and 2016 were sort of grappling with this sort of unifying call of the sort of first iteration of the Black Lives Matter movement. And it became the same call of activism that I really have felt my entire life, except I was in a moment of my life where I felt like I could write a story that helped maybe put a bigger lens to what is happening in terms of systemic issues that a lot of people either don't understand or haven't placed themselves in, or deeply know and want that story to be told, and want that story to be told not from a place of a victim, but someone who is a place of strength and speaking from a voice of activism and fighting against making change. Um, and so, I draw a lot of parallels, with my work and a lot of the conversations that are happening. And I feel very grateful that I've had an opportunity to talk about my work and the inspirations of my work, and all the supporters who want to read broadly, even if they don't quite fully maybe understand. It's a wonderful opportunity for all of us to read diversely, whatever that might mean for you. So I want to just share the next slide. Um, so the interesting thing that I was saying earlier about book banning and how when I was published, I never even thought of myself as, I thought of like great names of books that have just been, out there for decades and are sort of in the canon, very, classic books. And often those are the ones that, that I thought about when it was coming to banning. And it wasn't until I was tagged online on social media where I found that there was a fight within a community over whether or not my book should be in school in the schools in Pennsylvania, in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And the way I have always been as a writer when I've come to story or thinking about my life, it's always been very purpose driven and reasons why certain things happen. And the reason why I was so struck by my book being pulled in this particular community that in any other time I actually wouldn't even know the location of that community, because I'm from the West Coast. I'm not from the Midwest and East Coast. And what was so striking to me is that this particular county was actually a county that I did study. And the reason why I studied this particular county is that one of my future coming novels that I've actually been working on for the past couple of years, that I've sort of been holding as what's the right time to do, it's a historical fiction novel. And it's a story about sundown communities and communities that were sort of the first iteration of what we now consider suburban America, where we have the American dream house, dishwashers, washing machines, picket fences, and a dog. That all came from Levittown and the Levittown family. And there were 3 communities that had these communities where they were open to suburbia America and wanted to have the dream of building out access to building affordable homes. And this was right after World War II in the late 1940s and early 1950s. That started the boom of housing. And those homes were located in 3 locations originally. It was in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, in Levittown, Pennsylvania, Long Island, Levittown, and in New York, Levittown. And when I was writing my novel deals with the fact that this American suburban dream that many of us are living, right? Many of us are wanting to get out of the city and have big lawns and all these different things, is that community that started us a Korean American dream was an all white community where they actually restricted anyone Black owning a home. And so when this came out that my book was being banned in this particular community, to me, I thought it was my purpose, connecting again to say, hey, pay attention to the work I'm doing, because I had written my first draft and focused, deciding I wanted to focus in Long Island as a location because so much has changed in that community. And what that drew me to realize is that I need to tell the stories of communities that are still grappling with race, because of the reasons why my book was banned. And so I wanted to sort of share that story because that was the first time that I really had sort of been struck by my work, that my work, there was a purpose for what I'm writing, why I was so compelled is because these issues are all around us. And as an educator, I'm all about unpacking our histories, understanding them, talking about them, and growing from them. The other thing that I never sort of realized about book banning, which I'm going to tie it back to sort of the larger conversation of book banning and challenges, is that, it wasn't until I was asked to do one talk in May about book banning that I went online, and did a search, because I was like, am I banned anywhere else? Like, I heard about this one area, but like, am I actually banned? And so I went on Google and I looked up banning Kim Johnson and found these articles. And these are just a few examples of articles that I found just by Googling my name, which I don't really do. And since then, I've been included in multiple pieces, including the New York Times. I was recently on a panel last week with Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is the creator of the 1619 Project, and really which through her work, we saw a spike in the utilization of pushing the agenda, talking about critical race theory, as if that was anything that anyone actually understood at the time, like a true understanding of what it is, a true concept of what it is, and using that language, that framework that's in some law classes around studying actually where bias is applied in the law as sort of a language, as propaganda to kind of talk about reasons why we should not be looking at particular works. And, in this story about thinking about just my own experience of being banned, is that there are names that are out there that you can quickly say maybe a handful of books that you heard in the news, and you see the authors doing interviews and they're very prominent, and there's a lot of push of like support these authors. But the reality is that there are so many books that are being quietly pulled, quietly challenged, and will never make the news, will never create media traction. And so much of that is the fear that is pushed out there of, if a book is sort of called to question, a principal or a teacher or a librarian has the threat of potentially losing their job, a threat of being sort of suspended for work, for investigation, for why they included particular texts. And it is that fear that's there that we see before it makes the news. Books just, well, this might be too controversial, or I don't know how the parents are going to respond. Let me not use this book and let me use this other book. And that is dangerous. And that is dangerous for us as a society, and especially in the values that we hold ourselves to, that we say that we are in the US, that we are a place of freedom, when we're starting to act like other places that we tend to be much more critical of, because of how they restrict those. Next slide, please. So this is just some data from last year. In 2021, in looking at, last year, 2021 alone, there were 729 documented challenges, right? Challenges that sort of made the alerts. and challenges of almost 1,600 books. I was just looking at recent data from the American Library Association, where just in 2022, right now, not even at the end of the year quite yet, 2022 is set to exceed the record of 2021. So between January 1st and August 31st, already documented 681 attempts to ban or restrict library resources, and over 1,600 unique titles were targeted. And a lot of this isn't necessarily sort of a typical parent in a school. Often a lot of this is actually orchestrated by organizations that have a particular agenda, they're providing particular language, and they are sort of armed with information in a way that so many areas are not organized to actually get the larger voices that often are the majority in communities that do want those books that are out there. I was so thrilled, and I'm so thankful tonight that there are two representatives here from the Intellectual Freedom Committee for the Multnomah County Library. And it is that kind of structure that actually helps us fight injustices that are occurring on communities and books being targeted for reasons beyond that I can actually even understand or explain to you all today. And we see a lot of this orchestration tied in with things that are happening legally in our country. So we can look at anti-trans work and LGBTQ laws in Florida and Texas. We can look at the Supreme Court decision emboldening states to sort of abolish access to reproductive health. We can see this sort of political agendas impacting our educational systems, our libraries, where we should have access to read any book that's provided in the thousands and thousands and thousands of offerings that all of our wonderful libraries are able to provide. A lot of this is about censorship. Censorship isn't new. We can move to the next slide. Book challenges aren't new. I could see it's always been there. I mean, the Bible, has been challenged. There are all kinds of texts that have been challenged. What's interesting is that when there are challenges that are connected to particular identities and reasons for the lack of representation and those that are holding power, sort of going back to Plato's quote about access and power and voice and who gets to tell stories. You can see that throughout time. You can see this throughout in Germany during the Holocaust, where books were literally burned so that the histories and the stories and the languages and the religion could be erased, because if you take away the knowledge, you take away a sort of future believers, future communities that understand this. This isn't new. We see it in Beijing with the seat of Chinese government having done massive censorship of media. We see this in Russia. We see this in Peru. I mean, we see this in North Korea. We see this all over the world. What's interesting in the US, we often try to tell ourselves, our story is that we are not like those other places. But in so many ways we are. When we think about censorship in the identities, going back to the titles, so thinking about those, titles that were challenged, 729 challenges, the 1,600 books that were challenged in 2021. If we look at who were the authors of those books, when we think about large representation of who is actually able to tell their story and be published, that take a minuscule amount of the representation that is out there, and then we compare that to the books that are challenged, it is overwhelming and clear that there is an agenda there. There's a fight for not having that representation told because of the dominant narrative. So looking at 379 titles, 33% of the titles were about challenging books that had transgender, binary, non-binary characters in the stories. 41% were stories that had protagonists of color. When you think about how difficult it has been to get access to representation of these stories, and then finding these titles being taken away. Think about the representation of Jewish and Muslim or religious ethnic characters that are non-Christian, having those books that have such few representation. There is an agenda that's there. Again, this is not new. Let's think about it with literacy. Access to learning how to read and write and reading. We can go to the next slide. Almost 250 years ago, Phyllis Whitley had the first volume of poetry by an African-American poet to be published. She was enslaved at 7 years old, brought directly from a slave ship. She was later caught writing on a wall with chalk. And years later, she traveled to England where she was able to publish her work and eventually returned to America where she was finally given her freedom. And if we think about it was 75 years later and 175 years ago that Frederick Douglass published the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. And almost overnight for his work became the most celebrated Black author in history. These narratives and being able to tell your story of being enslaved, there have been 6,000 narratives documented, written by African Americans who were enslaved that were published between 1700 and 1950. Imagine the kind of knowledge, empathy that could have been told if it wasn't illegal for those that were enslaved to read, for if you were Black to be able to read and write. There's a reason why not wanting to provide access to literacy, it's all about control. It's all about control of telling the story, humanizing people. Next slide. So many of you have heard this quote. I love it. I say it all the time. I think it inspires me every day when I think about my writing, when things get really hard and the words don't come to me, and why I decide to write on topics that can be really challenging, not only to write, but to talk about as well. And to me, it's all about providing representation, being able to provide representation and tell those stories. And that's why it's so important that we all become aware of what's happening with these challenges and who is being challenged, and having a better understanding and belief that we shouldn't be arguing about, well, this one shouldn't be challenged because of this, and this one I can see why maybe it was challenged because some people don't. We have to get to a point where we aren't banning books. Why am I the one to be able to make that judgment? Why are you the one to be able to make that judgment about why a particular book is banned? Because people will access it. And if it's hateful speech, right? Because I don't support hateful speech. I don't support the hateful elements, but the industry will resolve itself based on readers in that way. We have to get to a point where we shouldn't be shutting down windows and mirrors and sliding glass doors for people to be able to say whether or not a book has value, whether or not a particular book should be a part of the conversation for that. So we can go ahead and move to the next slide. And I'm almost done and we'll have time for questions. So much of the stories that I write, that I think about, they really are about resistance. And many of the authors whose books, whether it's directly related to particular experiences or identities, it's about resistance. It also is about imagining what is possible. That to me is a story about resistance. all the hubbub that's going on around about the remaking of the Little Mermaid, and having the main character be a Black mermaid, um, a story that likely won't touch on race at all. Entirely, I don't know, I haven't watched it yet, but I'm assuming that it likely won't. Maybe there might be some sort of like hidden elements that are there. But even that representation is resistance. It's resistance to a certain narrative about what it's possible to be, right? I think there's probably a small fraction of people who believe that they're mermaids. Most people don't believe that they're mermaids. And so the fact that we have this sort of imaginary thing that we then tell ourselves, no, there cannot be Black elves. There cannot be Black mermaids. But it's supposed to be imaginary, right? It's not supposed to be a real thing. All of these stories are about resistance, and going against challenges that are occurring and banning. We can be a part of that resistance of shutting down voices, and stories, that do need to be told. That do need to be told. Next slide. I'm just going to read just a small portion from my novel, and it's an example of being able to tell a story and doing a lot of research that I did, that I benefited so much from so many books and authors that have been banned and challenged, and how challenging that experience can be when you are a marginalized member of a community that often is fighting for equal access, and being seen. So this is kind of that's really closer to the end of my novel. It's no spoilers there. And this character is Jamal. So I'm going to go ahead and read. Now, you don't hear me see all these books. Jamal points around the scattered books I hadn't noticed are from the collections we rotated in and out to Daddy. W.E.B. Du Bois, James Baldwin, Thurgood Marshall, Michelle Alexander, Ta-Nehisi Coates, then a week's worth of newspapers. They all say the same thing over and over again. It doesn't matter when they were written. The laws might change, the systems might look different. All these books say what the problem is, working 10 times harder to get half. Seems to me all the blood that's been spilled ain't our debt, but we paying it over and over again. And the world acts like there's something wrong with us. They hate us so damn much. Jamal's voice is cracking, desperate words that have been suffocating him. 400 years and we still ain't American to them, T. All that blood, we built America. Black labor built the greatest nation in the world for free. They ripped us from our family then, and they do it again with new laws disguised as change. I'll be in prison doing that labor for free. That's a voice that needs to be heard and read and debated and questioned. Why? There's so many works that are out there, that are telling stories that need to be told. And I'm so grateful that you all are here today, to be present, and hopefully to be a part of reading more and more stories that should be told. I have some book recs. I love to just share them because it's the next slide. I just want to share a couple of books that I love, that if we didn't have representation, I would have never had the opportunity to read. When I was growing up and going to the library, I never got to read any books like that. And while I feel like I'm successful, I'm doing well, what would my conversations be like? How would I be thinking if I saw myself or other people in a lot of different ways? Would I have started writing earlier? Because I would have imagined that I was there. The last slide that I have here is a resource slide. I know that the Multnomah County Library, and we've got some great contacts here, have lots of different resources, but I just wanted to just share some resources, especially for teachers. Often, a lot of teachers come here. There's lots of great resources, but there's also just general resources for anyone, for librarians too, as well. And I am looking forward to seeing what questions that you have for me and how we can talk like a family in conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kim. And we're so lucky because we weren't able to get Alicia on earlier, who was going to do the introduction of Kim. So yay, we've got
Oh, I'm so glad they made it.
Alicia.
Yay.
So we're gonna add a spotlight there and open up to questions, and Alicia can facilitate that. So welcome, Alicia. Alicia, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, thank you for being patient with me. Internet is sometimes a pain in the butt, and my internet was out. I'm using my phone as a hotspot, so hopefully it will remain stable. My name is Alicia. I use they, them, or she, her pronouns, and I am a materials selector for the library. And my focus is on adult fiction, and we have a Black resource collection within the library. So I also do selections for all of the books that are in the Black resources collection. So do we have any questions from the gallery? You can post your questions in the chat, or you can also, is there a raise your hand filter or not filter thing on here? I don't think there is. Someone does have their hand up. Allison. Allison, you're muted.
I'm just saying there is a raise hand function. I was just
Okay.
showing. So
Modeling.
there is a
Modeling,
question
yes.
there. Yeah.
Okay, so this question is from Joanne. Any suggestions for supporting school libraries that are experiencing books being banned and censored?
Yeah, so I did share some resources, but I actually really want to hand it over to the experts. There's two representatives here from the Intellectual Freedom Committee. Yes, I'm going to call you out. I would love for them to jump in and share, and that's Jennifer and Laurel, I believe.
Laurel, you're muted.
Laurel was like, I don't want to talk.
No, I can talk, but we were just talking about this the other day. How do we support school libraries, and how do we support books not being banned and censored? And Jennifer, did you come up with a resource? I can't remember.
There's a couple of resources and I'll dig those up. But like the first thing off like the top of my mind is like showing support, and that can come in a various ways, like showing up at school board meetings, writing letters to the school district, or even, I think sometimes showing love and support for the authors too, just to make sure that they're being seen. But I will pull up, there's one general list that I will pull up.
And there's a Twitter feed, right? The Unbanned Books Twitter feed, where they're paying attention to what books are being banned. Let me see if I can find them real fast.
And as they look, I mean, that's what I've been communicating out when I talk with schools. I do talk with a lot of schools and students, and talking to them about talking with their parents, because what we're very reactionary often in many issues that are about access and rights, and sort of responding to rights being fought against. And I think being proactive to show that there is support, because if there is a school, and especially if there's a teacher in a particular community that they're worried about how vocal a particular parent or set of parents are, is that you can be a student and tell your teacher how you want to diversify your curriculum, recognizing the lack of representation that might be in the curriculum, encouraging parents to be able to actually email the principal, the school board, the teachers, to be able to say, I really recognize that there's been a lack. What about our students that are not being seen in the classroom? And how are we going to prepare the next generation of our young people if they're not in understanding of a diverse environment? And I think it's adding more voices that actually are seeking and wanting this in their curriculum, and not just waiting for you to sort of get the syllabus, for it and responding to it. And I'll give there's simple things you can do. Like I gave an example of the year that my book came out. My son was a freshman in high school, and he received his syllabus for his English class. And the book that they had on their reader list, they had To Kill a Mockingbird. And that is a very sort of common text. It's a classic, it's in the canon. And, I think there's many reasons that it should be read. I personally have my own agenda of having my book replace To Kill a Mockingbird, because I think it is much more relevant and centered around Blackness in a way that To Kill a Mockingbird wasn't, and is very dated. And so I made sure to email my son's teacher that I would be willing to come into his class, or tell him about, if you're going to have that text, it really would be nice to sort of center a story from the experience of those that actually were impacted, since To Kill a Mockingbird actually doesn't have the voice, the centered voices of Black people who were sort of experiencing what's happening. And that's ways that you can actually help teachers, help school libraries to think about supporting them when it feels like they're so alone and they have the fear. They keeping your livelihood is a way that we're just all kept in line. We want to pay our bills. We want to make sure we have our insurance. And so the threat of losing that is often the thing that keeps us in line. And so we can support each other in those ways.
I believe we still do this. Our school corps librarians had a training for Portland Public School teachers about including newer books because they resonated more so with children and had more diversity. And so they have a training about that. And I think it totally supports what you're saying.
Yeah, that's great.
Totally necessary.
I have a question. As one of the selectors, we sometimes get the messages from patrons about things that they don't want to see on the shelves. And we have to respond to those. And one of the things that is coming up, at least in Portland, is books that are harmful. Books, people are challenging books that are, I'm trying to think of Andy NG, his last name is NG, and I'm not sure how to say it correctly. He has a book, and he's a kind of, I think, on the Proud Boy spectrum. And then there was also another book about a very negative book about transgender. It was about the transgender agenda is affecting our girls or something like that. I can't remember what the name of the book is. What are your thoughts on those kind of challenges of books that are actually harmful to the community?
Yeah, that is a hard one for me, because I think most of the books that are challenged are from communities that have been oppressed and haven't been represented. And and it's not like there's an agenda against another person. It's mostly about, I want to be free. I want to be me, and let me be me in this story, right? Often that's what a lot of these stories are. And you could say that with some of the stories of well, let me believe what I want to be, but there's sort of a harmful component that's associated with it. And so I really do struggle. And I have evolved in my thinking, because before I was like, yeah, no, get that out of here. Like that, like that's trash. That's sort of like my most sort of like first immediate, reaction. But there's less of that than there is of the other works. And so drawing the line often, we end up losing those that want the divert. We end up losing because then there can be a line that's drawn. But that doesn't mean that if there is something that actually is harmful, that doesn't mean you have to carry every book. There are millions of books, that are there. And if you have readers in your community that aren't necessarily seeking that, and it's perpetuating sort of a violent act or things that are harmful in that way, that doesn't mean that you have to carry it. That doesn't mean that you have to promote every single book that's there. It's not necessarily about banning, but you do have to curate. As a librarian, you do curate your library and make decisions, because you can only hold so many books. That's challenging. I don't really have a good answer, other than I think that we lose more than we sort of win on that side. But especially if it's for teens, we want to make sure that are people being harmed in this story, right? Are they harm? Is it going to harm others? And that's why I think there's a responsibility to be careful, because someone being their identity and just wanting to be their identity is not overall exuding hate towards others, right? It's not saying that there's an agenda and it's not necessarily doing that. It's just about let me be me. I don't have rights like other people have rights. Let me be me. And some of those other stories are often, wait, who are all these people trying to get their rights? Why are they trying to take up a space that I have sort of like occupied? And I think that's different. But I don't feel like I am the person who should be the one that's making the decisions, for that. And I would look very closely. I would be the person that would be looking at a teacher if they have that kind of stuff in there. How is that? Is this hateful? We're not necessarily, that's not what we're trying to teach, right? That actually, is hurtful to others. So, but it's tricky to say where that line is, but I definitely, I've evolved in that. Although again, I'm not a supporter of that agenda. So.
Another question I have for you, I guess. Actually, I'm going to go to Michelle has her hand up, or their hand up.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yep. You're a little quiet, but I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, I'm trying with this mic.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, it's so great to see all of you guys. And I don't know if I have so much of a question as more of like a comment and like a thank you to Miss Johnson for writing this book. And I had the opportunity to pick the book for a mystery book club I'm a part of. And it's predominantly white and older women. And so, but at first I was nervous to bring it up because most of the books we would read are from like authors from England or France or whatever. And it actually was pretty awesome. And then there was just this one lady, this one lady that, and I had sent you a message. I don't know if you remember because you probably, talk to a lot of people on Instagram, but she was saying, "Oh yeah, this book was about class. It wasn't about race at all."
I
And
do
so,
remember you. Yeah.
right? And I was just like, "Oh, so I imagine that they came to the young lady's house and burned a cross. That really didn't happen, So that was not about class, So, but I just and then during the meeting, usually we talk one at a time, but there was like a lot of cross talking, and the other ladies were telling her that no, it is about race and class, and she was like, no, it's not about race. And I was just like, oh my goodness, like it's unfortunately that there's always that one, but compared to that one, there was like over 10 that, well, I don't want to say enjoyed reading the book 'cause it was sad, but were informed, you know.
Mhm.
So I'm just thankful that you wrote that book, and I can't wait for the new one.
Thank you. Thank you. And I really, this piece is really important to me just to emphasize my love of reading. When I started, it was all about mysteries and thrillers. Me and Nancy Drew, like this, besties, every book. All of those. Encyclopedia Brown, one of the first early, okay, what's the answer? Okay, what happened? Am I right? Okay, cool. Those were the books that I loved. And so a lot of my stories have those elements to it that often actually don't get told, especially when you're writing sort of a social justice kind of story. And so I love to call my work social justice thrillers. So that it has these sort of elements in it. And I really appreciated that my publisher understood that I wanted to touch upon the sort of the mystery and thriller readers too as well, because my story has, if you were to take away race and make the story about class, it would be also a very interesting story that maybe would have different aspects and things that would be sort of emphasized in it, but it's a representation of something that often doesn't get shown, that is sort of like true to life often. So thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you for being brave to bring it to your to your book club.
I find that really interesting. We often get questions from our patrons asking for books that feature or center BIPOC characters that aren't, so much about struggle necessarily, which can be really difficult. But
Yeah.
it feels like there are more books now where they are thrillers or mysteries or suspenses or romance that don't ignore those issues. That they're very present, but it's just kind of enveloped into the story. And I'm wondering what you think about like publishing trends. Are you seeing, like more of those kind of titles coming up? And yeah, what are you looking forward to?
Yeah, no, I mean, to me, that's really exciting. And it is an internal community conversation that does occur about what story should we tell and should we feed the narrative about struggle. And I absolutely agree that there has been a sort of dominant understanding and representation of struggle, so that there's nothing more than struggle. And I even get that sometimes when people are reading my story and wonder, like, why did you have a love triangle in this story? Or like, why did you focus on like so much family elements in the story? Like, why didn't you do these other kinds of things? And that really was for me, really trying to build a story that is much more in-depth, three-dimensional, of real life, of all the things that as a Black young girl in the main story and her family can be and are, that they are worried about what they're going to wear at school tomorrow and the friendships that they have and all these other layers that are there. There is something to be said about publishing and publishing's narrow acceptance of what Black story, and I'm going to talk specific, it translate across many identities, but I'm going to speak specifically because that's the community that I most closely identify with, is that there is definitely something to be said about this sort of narrow perspective from publishing about what would be the kind of stories for Black representation that was there, that has really held back the narrative. So there's so that the slave narrative, right, the struggle narrative, the abuse, poor, life, all terrible things happening, and then someone comes and saves them, typically not someone Black, someone white, and then they're like, it's amazing, right? There are these narratives that have been fed for very long. And so you see a new generation of writers, and it's always been there, but especially a new generation of writers who were like, I refuse to write about anything other than fantasy, and I'm not going to deal with race, or I'm not going to do with that. And sometimes it does cause tension, because then I'm like, man, but I'm doing good work, y'all. This is what I'm contemporary. I'm present. I bear witness. I'm involved in activism and organizing. That is what I write about. That is what I breathe and live by. And so, but I also, when I buy books for my kids and go to the store, I want to buy my kids fantasy, because I have no interest in fantasy. I'm very limited, and usually it's because I have a author friend who writes that work, and then I'll force myself to read it and I'll love it. But it's not going to be the first thing I pick up, and it's because I didn't see myself in it. And so when I go to the bookstore with my kids, I make sure that they read my good friend Namina Forna's The Gilded Ones. That does deal with the patriarchy and feminism and all these other sort of communities and such. And the industry, has really started to recognize it. And you start to see there are so many fantasy books, which typically often wasn't as represented. So many romance books, so many books of intersectional identities, where you have someone who is, a Black non-binary person who is just trying to go to school, like there's so much more there. And to me, that's incredibly exciting, because I think we all need to be at the table. I don't believe that there should be, well, let's just not have this. It's like, no, actually, as an author, you should be able, and especially a Black author, you should be able to write about whatever you're passionate about, what you love to read, and not what you think the publishing industry wants, or the space that you have. And that is a space that I want publishing to be in, is that any BIPOC diverse author can write the stories that they want to write, and not be squeezed in by the industry saying, nobody wants to read those stories, because they do, because they sell. And they do it internationally. I mean, it's been amazing to see so many of my, debut friends who've done incredibly well telling stories that internationally have just taken over. Ayana Gray, B. Saroon, Tracy Dion, who just has her book Bloodmarked come out. I mean, just amazing stories. Kaylin Barron, Cinderella's Dead, and her other like 5 million books that she's written since her debut. I mean, it's amazing. It's really, it's amazing. And many of us worry that our little window that we had is going to go back and close again. So keep reading our books, keep reading all of our books.
So we have another question here from Kathy. Could the debate over which books should be banned be used to teach students about critical thinking? For example, assign a book in high school English class that could seem as dangerous or offensive, and walk them through the process of analyzing the merits or dangers that would come from reading it.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that there's so many ways. I mean, I shared the example of To Kill a Mockingbird. There's so much merit there in the work and putting yourself in the time period, right? In that particular time period. But then discussing what was missing there, and who got to have the voice, and why was that particular story building on a narrative that actually kind of goes against when you think about some social justice elements that are there. And so I think that there's a space for that. But I also don't think it should be the dominant story. Like, I think you can do critical thinking, because so much of the work, especially new work that's coming out, are touching on experiences and topics that really haven't been addressed in a critical way to understand. And I think that you can still do critical thinking with that, and build in, when you think about a debate class where you have okay, you're just going to be pro this and you're going to be anti this. I think there's so many ways to build and use critical thinking through empathy, and I wouldn't want that to be the dominant way, because then that already takes up so much space that is already there, that's everywhere for it. But I think it can be a good tool and good use in many ways. Maybe you don't make them read the whole book. Maybe you make them read them like a section or paragraph.
So Joanne is asking if we could have the authors that you mentioned. You talked about some of your author friends, and I was trying to take notes, but could we have a list of those authors that you were just talking? Could you share it in the chat for folks who?
Yeah, and I have a page on Bookshop that I will multitask talking to you all and seeing if I can remember my login that has a link of all those books that you could just look at, that you can likely get them all at the library. You don't have to, I just put it because it's convenient, because people ask me this all the time. But just look at the name of the title and get your books wherever you get your books. But yeah, so keep asking me questions and I will like do multitasking duty looking for my list book.
I have a question just about, we've touched a bit on critical race theory, and there's so much backlash against critical race theory. Do you see a connection? What is the connection that you see with that and the books that are being challenged?
It's just language. It's like a stamp that people use. They create a talking point and they paint everything with a talking point, and it actually isn't touching on anything, because critical race, there's many theories, there's all kinds of theories. It just sounds kind of scary, like, oh, it's critical and it's about race, and it just invokes this, oh, my poor white child is going to feel so bad in the classroom. And it's like, well, what about all the other kids who've been feeling bad since the beginning? Yeah, it's just it'll be another word next time. It's just how, they've taken the word woke and then now made it a negative, they just take words and they translate it. It has no business in any of this banning, because it actually doesn't explain. And, in very shorthand, I think critical race theory, it's a kind of theory, and there's many theories. It's a kind of theory that's taught in law schools of, let's study the law, because, wow, you're in law school, you should probably study the law, right? Like that's kind of like what you do when you're going to law school, is you're studying the law, and they're studying a particular, what is the impact of race in the law. And there's so much data that actually is very clear that there's stuff going on there. There's good data that shows that there's stuff happening there that has nothing to do with trying to think of all the anti-racist baby book. Like that's not critical race theory. No one's looking at the law. They're just saying, be good, be kind, be welcome to everyone. If anything, my book was inspired by Bryan Stevenson's life's work and reading his novel, Just Mercy. It was inspired by reading Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, which looks at the impact of particular communities, whether you're Black, brown, and poor, as Bryan Stevenson says, or with Michelle Alexander, looking at from enslavement to mass incarceration, looking at the sort of tracking of race. Like you could maybe tie my book, because it's looking critically, it's making that connection that's there, but there's actually nothing negative about that. Like, let's study the law. But most of the books that are banned, that they're saying it's CRT, it's just another word, because they don't want to say that they're racist or whatever. Like that's basically what it is. They gave it a little fancy name that they feel like they can use.
Are there books that made white kids feel uncomfortable, or might make white kids feel uncomfortable, or might make cisgendered,
exactly,
feel uncomfortable?
Yeah, exactly, because people are like, why do I need to learn? Why do I need to say something different than I've ever, all that kind of stuff. So yeah.
Meanwhile,
And
we've all been
I'm
experiencing those things are
constantly.
those uncomfortabilities, because you mentioned about when you were reading as a kid, you were really into Nancy Drew. I was really into Sweet Valley High. Not a single Black person or person of color or like queer person. There was nobody but suburban white kids. But that's what was available for me to read when I was a teenager, and it really turned me off of reading, honestly, once I got to high school, because there just wasn't anything that reflected me. And I was having to read things like To Kill a Mockingbird, which I didn't like, but everyone has to read it, I guess. Yeah.
And it's very similar with me, is that I was such an avid reader. I loved reading. I would read, all weekend, all day long. Would hate when I have to pull away. It was almost like I thought I was watching a TV show when I was reading. And, my mom would say, come clean the, this. I'm like, no, but the story will still go on, because if I was watching TV or something. But then when I hit high school, when I started to really want to know myself, it wasn't as interesting to read. But what it does show is, what do I have in common with Nancy Drew, a story that was written in the 50s and 60s. I mean, I don't even actually remember when it was sort of first originated, or even Sweet Valley High, if it didn't have that, as you're sort of like understanding yourself and not seeing yourself there. We still were able to find a thread of empathy and understanding and seeing ourselves. And it's the same thing of why diverse books should be read widely, because all the time marginalized communities are put in spaces where they have to understand, other communities and see themselves as we're human, right? We're human. So,
anyone else have any questions that they want to, or comments, or talk about your favorite book or book you're reading right now? Michelle.
Hi again. I like the thought just came in my head. It was interesting that we as humans have such a hard time like empathizing with other humans, but yet, bringing up the Little Mermaid again, we can't, people can't seem to wrap their minds around, the Little Mermaid changing from what they thought she was, but we can't do that with our fellow humans. I just thought that that was wild. But yeah, I got to read quite a few banned books, and I didn't know they were banned, and they opened my eyes and helped me to be a more compassionate person. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Kim, did you find that? Oh, you did.
I did.
Awesome.
The first one isn't the right link, but the second one, and it's not updated. I've read so many more books that are updated, but those are a variety of different books. One related to either inspirations or resources that I read when I was reading This Is My America, or what I would say read next. And then I have some young adult recommendations, many of them for which I did list in that slide, but not all of them. And there's so many more that I've read, but those are some of my favorites that came out in 2020, 2021 for that. And then I have my Black liberation and activism books. So my Black femme and Black liberation books, right? So I should update it though. There's so many wonderful books that have came out this past year or two.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And if there's anything on there that we don't have, I'll make sure we get it. I appreciate that. I have a question for you as a writer. We're kind of inching out of the pandemic. What was it like? Like, did you feel motivated to write during this time when we were kind of told to stay still for a little bit? And it was a chance that I think a lot of us were people who had the privilege of not going to work every day, or like me, I work from home now. You know, we had some time to do some introspection, and I wonder, like, as a writer, how that affected you.
Yeah, it definitely was in different waves. And I feel like that's the thing that so many people in general like had different moments where they felt like incredibly productive, or people all of a sudden were learning how to bake, you know, during the during the pandemic, or crochet, or you know, whatever habits that we did. You know, it was, what was interesting for me was because so I work, so my non-writing world, you know, I work at the University of Oregon, and I was so in the throes of the transition of trying to get the campus in my unit to go from no Zoom world to all of a sudden Zoom world, and how do you provide services. And so, I mean, I was working like 12-hour days with my team, and so there was very little writing going on. And then when summer finally hit, I really kind of like sat up to be like, wow, you know, I worked so hard to be published. I was supposed to have this big tour. And then now all of a sudden they don't know what they're going to do. Like they didn't, you know, in July when my book was coming out, um, you know, they didn't really know like how should we do book events. And we really were just seeing like, oh, well, my friend did this thing. Can I do this thing? And so I was so busy in that kind of space that I really didn't write for a really long time. And I was promoting my book for like the first 6 months. I was really busy promoting my book. But when December hit, December of 2020, I had just finished working on my draft for, it's called Sundown right now, but that's not going to be the name of it. That's the historical fiction that I was telling you about. I had finished my draft, I'd sent it to my editor. She was looking at it. She was going to give me feedback. And I was inspired by a new idea. And I hadn't written something new in so long, because even the draft I was working on, it was like, I had the first draft before the pandemic even hit. And I was really inspired. It was the fastest I'd ever written a novel, where it was like I had my first draft in like less than a month. And it was a messy draft. So don't like be like, oh, that's awesome. No, it was messy and ugly. But for me, I need to get it out there, and then I can like fix it. So it would not be something that I would ever share with anyone. And I was really inspired. And so I had this like wave of that. And that's when I shared it with my publisher, and we decided that that should be my next book. And that I should hold off on the other book, because I was so in the moment of writing, which that's the kind of writer I am. I like to bear witness about what is on my spirit, what do I feel I'm being called on. I open myself to messages that feel like they're coming from other places, and I write. And it's very hard for me to write just to be, like, someone was to say, hey, write about this. Like I would be someone who, it would be very difficult for me to just start writing about something that I'm not passionate about, something that didn't come from my mind or inspiration. And so I was in a space for a good window where I was really writing and really sort of knocking out the work. And then it went silent. And now I'm in a silent mode. I've been, because I finished that book, and now I've been in silent mode for months and months and months. And I'm now sort of like lifting my head up to be like, okay, let me go back to Sundown and start thinking about this work again.
So do you sleep?
I am not a good sleeper. I've been better. I've listened to now like the Good Vibes meditation app that has like a sleep app that actually has really helped my sleeping. But that is hard, because when you're busy, oftentimes people say, oh, you're so busy, you must sleep really hard. And that's not true, because when I'm really busy, then I'm thinking about what I didn't finish, what I need to do, what I got to do tomorrow. And so, yeah, no, I'm not a good sleeper.
You seem like, I just had to ask because you seem like you have a lot going on.
There is a lot going on.
And that's
and a little bit of failing at almost everything.
Anyone have any other questions? if not, we could wrap it up and give Kim back a little bit of her time, busy time. Thank you all for attending this event. Thank you so much, Kim. This was a really informative. It was great to have this conversation with you. It was great to just learn about your process and what you were thinking about when writing your book, and the things that you're taking into consideration in terms of books that are challenged, and fighting back against that and getting your book in school. And I think that your book should definitely take the place of To Kill a Mockingbird.
Sign the petition. Just kidding. There's no petition. But if there is one, let me know.
Get a change.org petition started.
Yes, thank you so much. It was a wonderful evening with you all. And thank you so much to Multnomah County Library. Allison, thank you for kicking us off. And Alicia, I'm so glad that you were able to connect. So thank you all, everyone.